Excuse me, please don't put your paw in my fake martini. It's, oh my goodness, it's still not yours. I love you. Are you in my shot? I think you're in my shot. Every hotel has its ghost. The Overlook had a whole coven of them, and so does Stephen King. Or would those be demons?
What's the difference between a demon and a ghost?
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to David's Den. I'm David, and I'm doing a Stephen King readathon in publication order. In the last video, I gave you my halfway through review of The Shining, which turned into an examination of early Kingisms that I have noticed after reading his first 4 books back to back. I cut that video short before exploring the last Kingism because
it's way too long.
And I had more to say. I discussed King's style and literary techniques, and I'm calling that video Part 1. I would suggest watching that first to lay some groundwork for you. The link is right here, and I'll leave it in the description below. But if you know The Shining already, you should be fine. Oh, and this seems like a good time to tell you that there will be more spoilers in this discussion than there were in the previous video, now that we've actually finished the book. So if you aren't familiar with The Shining, well, number 1, be warned, and number 2,
why are you here?
So, this video is Kingisms Part 2, in which I will be examining the autobiographical nature of King's works with a focus on his 4th published novel. Okay, it's the 3rd published novel as Stephen King, but I am including Rage, which was released under the pseudonym Richard Bachman. So, this is his 4th published novel, the 1977 classic, The Shining.
Red rum. Red rum.
And damn you, Kubrick, for such a blatant disregard of the source material.
I really enjoyed The Shining. I think that was my favorite of all of your books. But I really hated the movie. And
I felt a little bit as though I had given Stanley Kubrick a live hand grenade and he had heroically thrown his body on it.
Sort of picked up the phone and I said, "Stanley, how are you?" And he wanted to talk about ghosts. And wasn't the horror story or the story of ghosts always fundamentally optimistic? Because it suggested that we went on afterward. And I said, "Well, it is, Stanley, but what if a person died insane and came back?" There was a long silence. And I said, also, what about hell? What if there really is hell?
Since Kubrick's version has been analyzed to death, although it is arguably one of the greatest films of all time when you think of it as its own entity, as if it weren't based on a book with themes that the movie mostly ignored. As we move forward with The Shining, I will be instead reviewing the miniseries from 1997, which was penned by Stephen King himself, starring Steven Weber and Rebecca De Mornay. And I have a little something extra for you between now and then that I'll tell you about later. But the week after I review the miniseries, I will be taking a deep dive into the book and the adaptation to see how faithful it is to the source material in theme and tone, as well as plot.
Because when an interviewer says to me, well, what scares you? You know, this is one of the questions you come up against. I'm a little bit flabbergasted because my immediate response is, let's try to think of something that doesn't scare me, you know, in one form or another. And I think one of the things that you do after a while is you begin to search out the things that scared you the most and try to get rid of them, you know.
With this mentality, it is not surprising that King throws himself into his work, drawing on his own experiences. For example, almost all of his books happen in small Maine towns like the one King himself lives in. He also worked in an industrial laundry facility for a time, just like Margaret White and Carrie, the unfortunate victims in his short story The Mangler, Barty Dawes, and Roadwork, and many more. King taught in a high school setting, like we saw in Carrie and Rage. Yes, Rage is from a student's perspective, but he started writing the book while he was still a high school student. And then he returned to the story and finished it after he had become a teacher. And you can see both points of view in the novel. Discussion on that right here if you're interested. Ben Mears, our protagonist in Salem's Lot, is a novelist returning to his small Maine hometown, and coming up later in the readathon, well, we all know the premise of Misery.
I'm your number 1 fan. I'm your number 1 fan.
And this brings us to The Shining, the ultimate haunted house story, and arguably the novel into which King infused the most of himself at the time of a novel's writing.
There's enough of me in him to make me think, well, you know, I could have gone a different route, and I would have been there, maybe not in the Overlook, but so he scares me.
Are you in my shot, Cat? Please do not put your paw in this. Yeah, bless you. That's what happens when you stick your nose in a martini glass of water. What are you doing with my coaster? Oh my God, you are crazy. Come here. I love you. I love you so much, but you need to get down. Okay. Jack Torrance is a writer and a recovering alcoholic who takes a job as the caretaker for the Overlook Hotel while it is shut down for the harsh winter months high in the Rocky Mountains. He moves into the hotel with his wife, Wendy, and his son, Danny, who has a kind of ESP that lets him see the future and hear other people's thoughts.
My gram called it shining on. The Bible calls it having visions, and the scientists call it precognition. But it all comes to the same thing, no matter what you call it.
Seeing the future.
This also makes him very in tune with a hotel that has a checkered past, which has left psychic marks on the building, especially in room 217.
217, isn't it?
Maybe and maybe not. Just promise me you won't go in.
I promise.
Okay, maybe my anger at this one was misdirected toward Kubrick. I admit my mistakes, and this is understandable from a business perspective.
Am I mad? Am I mad?
Not anymore. Now, as I said in part one, at its core, The Shining is an in-depth allegorical examination of divorce, specifically a family torn apart by alcoholism. It is also about the conscious attempt of parents to shield their child and the subconscious legacy that parents leave imprinted on their children in spite of their best intentions.
They were coming home and saying a lot of words, also at the supper table, that they never learned from their parents. Well, maybe they did, but maybe their parents didn't know they were listening at that time.
Now, you may ask, if you know King's history at all, what could he possibly have to be scared of that would lead to a novel about divorce? King met his wife Tabitha at the University of Maine when they were students, and they have been happily married since 1971. Oh my God, Hugo, now you're going to join in this? Both of you get off the table, please. King and his wife also have they have 3 amazing children, just like my cats, that I love in spite of how difficult you are right now. 2 of King's children have even grown up to become writers themselves. Well, regarding his marriage before King sobered up, let's just say that on one occasion, his wife kicked him out of the home in Bangor, Maine. Now add to that the stress that 2 young children can put on a marriage when at least one member, Stephen King I'm talking about here, is struggling to get his career off the ground. And yeah, there were problems. There was ominous quiet, yet that phrase was the real thing anyway. Still, tense meals where the only conversation had been, "Please pass the butter," or "Danny, eat the rest of your carrots," or "May I be excused, please?" The nights when Jack was gone and she had lain down dry-eyed on the couch while Danny watched TV. The mornings when she and Jack had stalked around each other like 2 angry cats with a quivering, frightened mouse between them. It all rang true. Oh dear God, do old scars ever stop hurting? Horribly, horribly true.
That was the first time that my wife and I ever had like a weekend off from the kids. The kids were really young. We were living in Boulder, Colorado. I was working on the stand at that time. Huh. And we had Tab's younger sister with us, and she said, "Go on, take the weekend, just go west, stop somewhere." And we ended up stopping at a place called the Stanley Hotel. It was their last day of the season. Everybody was leaving, and nobody was coming in.
Now, the rest of that story is a little rambling.
Look who's talking.
fucking quark, but you gotta love him, right? That story in that clip is also pared down considerably, so let's just cut to the inspiration section for The Shining on StephenKing.com. Wandering through the Stanley Hotel's corridors, I thought that it seemed the perfect, maybe the archetypical setting for a ghost story. That night, I dreamed of my 3-year-old son running through the corridors, looking back over his shoulder, eyes wide, screaming. He was being chased by a fire hose. I woke up with a tremendous jerk, sweating, all over within an inch of falling out of bed. I got up, lit a cigarette, sat in the chair looking out the window at the Rockies, and by the time the cigarette was done, I had the bones of the book firmly set in my mind. And the fire hose snake did make the final edit. Suddenly, Danny heard it behind him, coming for him, the soft, dry whicker of that brass snake's head as it slithered rapidly along the carpet after him like a rattlesnake, moving swiftly through a dry field of grass. It was coming for him. Okay, great. So King got scared of ghosts in an empty Grand Hotel. He had an idea for a haunted house story, and he wrote it.
Big fucking deal.
Right? Well, in a 1980 interview with We magazine, King said that every novel is to some extent an inadvertent psychological portrait of the novelist. I love that word, inadvertent. Just the idea that our psyches can go behind our backs, so to speak, and sneak little hints and things into our words and actions, into a novelist's novel, even, without our conscious knowledge of it. Now, I'm not saying King wasn't trying to exorcise some of his personal demons.
What's the difference between a demon and a ghost?
Or work through some of his internal conflict, but if the idea for The Shining came to him so quickly, and he had the bones of the book in place in just a few hours.
I've written for emotion and rewritten for something else, something that's harder to name without sounding either too pompous or too humble. I guess you could say that whole body rewrite comes in an effort to satisfy my own intellectual curiosity.
One has to believe that the topics of a marriage on the rocks, alcoholism, and the fear of f***ing up your kids snuck into the novel before he realized what was happening.
Careful the tale you tell, that is the spell. Children will listen.
So what did King's life look like the night he stayed in the deserted Stanley Hotel in 1974? In an interview for The Guardian in 2000, King said, "I had a period where I thought I might not be good enough to publish. I started to sell short fiction to men's magazines while I was in college. I got married 6 or 7 months after graduating. And for the first 2 years, I sold maybe 6 stories a year, and I had the money I was making teaching, too." Now, this was happening right around the time in 1974 that his first novel was being published, Carrie, which was not an instant success.
Why does this sound so familiar?
Jack Torrance had been something of a catch for Stovington High School, a slowly blooming American writer, perhaps, and certainly a man well qualified to teach that great mystery, creative writing. He had published 24 short stories, he was working on a play, and thought there might be a novel incubating in some mental back room. I know, look, I hear you saying,
What's the big fucking deal, bitch?
King's a writer, and he wrote a main character who was a writer, right? We've already seen that in Salem's Lot. Now, that's not too far-fetched.
So fucking what?
I hear you, I do. So let's dig a little deeper. In that same interview with The Guardian, King said, "I always drank, from when it was legal for me to drink, and there was never a time for me when the goal wasn't to get as hammered as I could possibly afford to." This, of course, brings us to Jack Torrance levels of alcoholism. He would look at them, Danny and Wendy, and the self-loathing would bag up his throat in a bitter wave, even stronger than the taste of beer and cigarettes and martinis, Martians, as Al called them. If the bender had occurred on a weeknight, he would sleep for 3 hours, get up, dress, chew 4 Excedrins, and go off to teach his 9 o'clock American poets still drunk. He hadn't believed he was an alcoholic. The classes he had missed or taught unshaven, still reeking of last night's Martians. Not me. I can stop any time. Mashed fenders? Sure, I'm okay to drive.
Tonight I have the great pleasure to introduce to you a well-known author and very interesting man. Stephen Edward King was born in Portland, Maine in 1947. He likes beer but drinks an occasional gin and tonic, smokes a low-tar cigarette, and eats Excedrin dry when he has a headache.
And that morning I was up at 5 with a really good hangover, and my response to that sort of fright is to get drunk as fast as I can.
Now we have an alcoholic burgeoning writer in Jack Torrance who chews Excedrin through the whole novel, and although sober, constantly longs to meet the Martians again. At least he longs for them until the addiction takes over and he can't hold back anymore. Mr. President, I have met the Martians and am pleased to report they are friendly. He thought of Danny again. But Danny's face was pleasantly fuzzed and nondescript now. He had hurt Danny once, but that had been before he had learned how to handle his liquor. Those days were behind him now. He would never hurt Danny again. Not for the world. Well said, Jack. Spoken like a true addict. King became increasingly frustrated at his failure as a novelist. When he was drunk, his anger became focused on his children. I wanted to grab them and hit them, he has admitted. Even though I didn't do it, I felt guilty because of my brutal impulses. I wasn't prepared for the realities of fatherhood. Still tormented by a desire to hurt his children, he turned to the technique he had learned as a child himself, believing that if he wrote about something bad, then it would never happen. This resulted in The Shining, the story of a little boy whose alcoholic father tries to kill him. I think it's safe to say that King seemed to have some sort of self-awareness about his drinking problem, even on a subconscious level, because all the characters are him. The women are him in skirts, he guesses. But there's another element involved. It's the element of inspiration which lifts you past the point where the characters are just you, where you do achieve something almost transcendental. Although King's family didn't stage an intervention until 1987, after hard drugs had been added to the alcohol, King inadvertently took Jack Torrance a step beyond himself when he wrote a rock-bottom incident into The Shining that sobered Jack up for good. I am, of course, talking about the incident with the bicycle, which we will be examining shortly.
So ever since Carrie, when I worked purely by instinct and achieved what little I did mostly by accident, I have written for emotion and rewritten for something else, something that's harder to name without sounding either too pompous or too humble. I guess you could say that whole body rewrite comes in an effort to satisfy my own intellectual curiosity, because, dig, if every book has to be about something, and if the writer did an honest job, he didn't truckle, in Frank Norris's terminology, then the result is bound to be something that the writer cares about. And if the writer works very fast, as I do on first draft, there are apt to be some interesting connections which form almost on their own, the way snowflakes form. With Salem's Lot, it was the connection between small-town life, as I understood it growing up, and the whole idea of vampirism. With The Shining, it was the connection between alcohol abuse and child abuse. It was also the idea that while hotels may or may not be haunted in the off-season, human lives are almost always haunted by the lives of others. When I wrote The Shining the first time, the wasp's nest that Jack finds in the roof, the one where the wasps come back to life and sting his son in the middle of the night, that was there strictly as something that intensified the suspense, that made the tale-telling more personal and vital between me and the person that I call constant reader. Later on, thinking about what I'd written in a cooler frame of mind, it struck me that the wasps served as an adequate symbol for the pass-it-on nature of abuse. What we are able to live with as adults, what doesn't sting us, as the wasps in the nest won't sting Jack after they've stung his son, will sometimes sting our loved ones, as we ourselves were stung when we were younger. And the nest that comes back to life when it's supposed to be dead also expressed the nature of the overlook to me, and it seemed to me, too, that it was a viable way of expressing what I felt emotionally about ghosts and what ghosts are, if they are.
What's the difference between a demon and a ghost?
Let's break it down.
If the first draft is emotional, we can reasonably assume that's where the inadvertent portrait of the novelist happens, only to be cleaned up and focused through the rewrite for intellect. King did indeed make interesting connections, not the least of which are the wasps. The wasp motif returns time and time again throughout The Shining, and whether literally on his hand or internally on his psyche, they sting Jack. They sting his loved ones. Personal demons crop up when you least expect them to, stinging you over and over again, driving you to addictions, and you are trapped with them. Just like Jack is trapped in the Overlook. Scars are forever, no matter how hard you try to ignore them or think they may have been resolved. So of course, down in the basement, Jack finds the Overlook's entire history buried in rotting cartons. Then the nest coming back to life, which does indeed serve successfully as a symbol for the Overlook's ghost coming to life around the Torrance family, but it is also a fantastic metaphor for the marks left on us that we are afraid of, that we turn inward to either deal with or ignore, believing them to be as unthreatening as the dead wasps that were shaken out of the nest, until they come back to life and push us toward a coping mechanism. And not all of those mechanisms we can choose from might be healthy, like alcoholism. Your son seems to believe you to have seriously contemplated divorce.
Careful the things you say.
A young maiden.
Children will listen.
A sad young lad.
He spoke of it in an offhand way, but only because he believes you are no longer considering it. We never even discussed it. Not in front of him, not even in front of each other.
I don't communicate very well.
I think it's best if you understand everything, Doctor. Shortly after Danny was born, I became an alcoholic.
You are a fucking alcoholic!
I'd had a drinking problem all the way through college. Subsided a little after Wendy and I met. Cropped up worse than ever after Danny was born, and the writing I consider to be my real work was going badly.
I'll never be good at anything!
When Danny was 3.5, he spilled some beer on a bunch of papers I was working on. Papers I was shuffling around anyway, and oh, shit. It sounds so goddamn beastly said out loud. I broke his arm, turning him around to spank him.
I've been a lousy father.
3 months later, I gave up drinking. I haven't touched it since. I see. I knew the arm had been broken, of course. It was set well.
It's not enough.
If I may be frank, it's obvious that he's been in no way abused since then. Other than the stings, there's nothing on him but the normal bruises and scabs that any kid has in abundance. Of course not. Jack didn't mean... No, Wendy. I meant to do it.
Guilty, guilty, guilty. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Guilty.
I guess someplace inside I really did mean to do that to him, or something even worse. You know something, Doctor? This is the first time the word divorce has been mentioned between us. And alcoholism and child beating. 3 firsts in 5 minutes. That may be at the root of the problem.
Talk to your wife.
He sensed the things that were wrong. Chief among them, from his point of view, was not the broken arm, but the broken or breaking link between you two. Oh, we are wrecking this boy. It's not just Jack, it's me too, and maybe it's not even just us. Jack's father, my mother. Are they here too? Sure. Why not? The place is lousy with ghosts anyway. Why not a couple more? Oh, Lord in heaven, he's like one of those suitcases they show on TV, run over, dropped from planes, going through factory crushers, or a Timex watch, takes a licking and keeps on ticking. Oh, Danny, I'm so sorry.
Children will listen.
A sad young lad.
Daddy was a drunk.
It was more than humidity that brought back the sick and slimy sweat onto his brow and stomach and legs. The remembering did that. It was a total thing that made that night 2 years ago seem like 2 hours ago. There was no lag. It brought the shame and revulsion back, the sense of having no worth at all, and that feeling always made him want to have a drink. And the wanting of a drink brought still blacker despair. Would he ever have an hour? Not a week or even a day, mind you, but just one waking hour when the craving for a drink wouldn't surprise him like this. So if the wasp's nest is metaphor for those personal demons that come back to sting us and to hurt those we love, and the overlook is symbol for being helplessly trapped with those demons and the disease of alcoholism, trapped with your family as the relationship falls apart, trapped with this moment in your life, faced with a decision to stay with your wife,
if not for yourself, then for your child,
or to split, to stay sober,
if not for yourself, then for your child,
or to drink. This moment and this choice is all you have, and since you can't change the past, then what the hell is going on with room 217 or that damn bicycle?
I don't need to go into details, boy. But once it had to do with those damned hedge animals, and I saw something in one of the rooms. I want you to promise me that you'll never go in there, that you'll just steer right clear.
Which room?
Never mind.
217. 217, isn't it?
Maybe and maybe not. Just promise me you won't go in.
I promise.
Jack could hear the soft and futile sound of the doorknob being turned to and fro as something locked in tried helplessly to get out. Something that wanted to meet him, something that would like to be introduced to his family. As the storm shrieked around them and white daylight became black night. If he opened his eyes and saw that doorknob moving, he would go mad, so he kept them shut. And after an unknowable time, there was stillness. I argue that room 217 represents the darkest demon in Jack's psyche. Fear of failure. Failure at being a good father and a good husband. Failure to stay sober. Failure in his career, in his friendships. Eventually, the weight of these things become a self-fulfilling prophecy in spite of his best intentions, and that can drive a person mad. Like the snow, slowly piling up outside and trapping them in the overlook, trapping Jack in with his demons and with his addiction, Jack descends gradually into madness. At one point, coming from the CB radio, their one and only connection with the outside world, I might add, Jack hears his father's voice going up higher and higher, becoming something maddening, not human at all, something squealing and petulant and maddening. The voice of the ghost god, the pig god, coming dead at him out of his radio, and "No! You are dead! You are in your grave! You are not in me at all!"
Careful before you say, listen to me.
Because he had cut all of his father out of him, and it was not right that he had come back, creeping through this hotel 2,000 miles from the New England town where his father had lived and died. He raised the radio up and brought it down, and it smashed on the floor.
Children will listen.
When he is finally faced with his fear, his ghost, his demon in room 217, he can't stay sober. The disease takes over and he is helpless in its grip. But he is still trapped with his wife, with his son, and this demon. This piece that Jack thought he had cut out of himself literally becomes personified and tries to kill his child. Something that had lain slain in that tub for perhaps years, embalmed there in magic. I don't think they can hurt you. They're like pictures in a book. Close your eyes and they'll be gone. Time passed, and Danny was just beginning to relax, just beginning to realize that the door must be unlocked and he could go, when the year's damp, bloated, fish-smelling hands closed softly around his throat, and he was turned implacably around to stare into that dead and purple face. Jack's only recourse by the end of the book, with just a trace amount of his sane, sober self left, fighting to keep control, is to commit a gruesome suicide, saying to his son,
"Run away. Quick, and remember how much I love you."
Before aiming the hard side of the roque mallet at his own face. Jack's alcoholism tears his family apart by the end of the novel. Jack succumbing to his addiction and his wife and child running away so he would never see them again, which is, of course, the very thing that King himself was afraid of when he inadvertently wrote himself into The Shining.
I think one of the things that you do after a while is you begin to search out the things that scared you the most and try to get rid of them, you know.
Now,
That bicycle of yours.
as I mentioned earlier, the bicycle incident is Jack's rock bottom moment. The thing that makes him decide to get sober and begin to repair the damage his alcoholism has done to his family. To summarize quickly for you, Jack and his friend Al had been out meeting the Martians when Al was irresponsibly driving them home in the middle of the night. On a deserted street, as they rounded a corner, too late to see it, the car slams into a kid's bicycle. They hunt and hunt all over the area, but there is no body to be found. No injured child trying to hobble away to safety. Jack watches the obituaries for a few weeks, but nothing is reported. No police ever come to the door and arrest him or Al. It was just an empty bicycle standing upright in the street somehow in the middle of the night. The morning after, Wendy wants to talk about divorce for the first time, and knowing that that's what's on her mind when she says, "Let's talk," a hungover Jack chews on some Excedrin and asks her for 1 week to turn things around before she broaches the topic. Then, as we saw in the visit to Dr. Edmond's office, that conversation never happens. Jack did indeed turn things around for the better. Until they got to the Overlook, anyway.
Here's Johnny.
And that's it. That's all there is to it. Structurally speaking, it is just some character development, some exposition of events that took place before we ever joined the story that tell us that Jack has hit rock bottom.
Specifics.
Yes! Yes, I am hung up on this and slightly obsessing, and I will tell you why. The wasps are introduced and then they come back again. 217 is introduced and it comes back again. The dumbwaiter is introduced. The kitchen knife. The snowmobile. Danny's broken arm. They all come back. As we saw with Salem's Lot, King is a firm believer in the principle of Chekhov's gun. And yes, I admit these things are major events, but as I talked about in the last video with King's style and technique, memories come back in one-word thoughts or incomplete sentences hundreds of pages after they were introduced, and it sets the tone perfectly without wasting any time. There is not one extraneous word or moment in The Shining, and then the bike doesn't fucking come back.
Never, never, ever, ever.
When I was about halfway through the novel, this started to bother me. And I kept waiting and waiting. Nothing.
Nothing? 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 Tra-la-la?
Then about 3/4 of the way through the novel, I started to develop a crazy theory around the bicycle. Now, it might not hold any water considering King's expanded universe. Dr. Sleep is a sequel to The Shining, after all, when Danny has grown up. And I believe the Overlook is mentioned in Misery once, and Dick Halloran appears in it, so next week's video is going to be a little less structured than this. I have some points mapped out and some quotes flagged, and I just want to talk to you guys and present my theory. Who knows? Maybe it's just a crazy fan theory, or maybe it will actually add to your enjoyment or your understanding of the deeper themes of the novel. But again, I'll get to that next week. For now, I want to remind you of the deeper meaning behind The Shining. Its allegorical nature of a man who falls prey to his demons and addictions, which lead to a self-sabotaging of his own life, his own family. I want to remind you of just how autobiographical the character of Jack Torrance is to Stephen King. I want to take a moment to remember all of my points from the previous video, all of those early Kingisms we can see developing over the first 4 novels that were published in Stephen King's career. And that leads me to my Book Nook rating, and I think you could tell by now, I passionately give The Shining a rating of 5 stars out of 5. It would have gotten 6 to express my affection of the novel on a personal level, but I think that's cheating if you have set a maximum amount of stars for yourself to give. So hey, thanks for tuning into this book review here in David's Den. Coming up next week is my fan theory regarding the bicycle, followed by a standalone review of the 1997 miniseries adaptation of The Shining, before I tackle the adaptation correlation, comparing the book to the film. If you're interested in all of that, hit that like and subscribe button and don't miss those videos. I appreciate it and I thank you if you do. Once I finish up with The Shining, we're moving on to Night Shift, King's first published anthology of short stories that he has sold to various magazines and the like through the 70s, as well as a story or two that had never appeared in print before. I'm going to be doing more vlog-style videos for each story. To tell you the truth, I've already started making them, and stopping whenever there's an adaptation to examine it a little further. That's right, Children of the Corn is drawing near. But then again, so is Maximum Overdrive, so... See you then.